This is a series called The Case for God. This is episode 1, where we're going to delve into the design of the universe. We're going to talk about some of the theoretical arguments for design. We're going to get into the fine-tuning parameters of the universe, as well as the fine-tuning parameters that make Earth such a rare planet, and really kind of just delve into some of the mathematical probabilities around that and why it's such a great argument for an intelligent designer behind the cosmos.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Second and minute number 1 of potentially many tens or hundreds of hours of spiritual content.
Journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
How do you feel?
Ready to roll.
Okay.
Excited, optimistic for the future. Nervous, but that's part of, I think, embarking on any new journey.
Yeah. So perhaps what would be a good framing for this is I think let's spend a beat helping the audience understand some of the reasoning behind why we are doing what we're doing here today.
Sure.
And who you are and my role as a part of this, so people aren't confused as to who the master is in this thing, which is you, right?
Oh, I guess we'll see.
So why don't you share just a little bit about you, who you are, your background.
Sure.
And then we'll dive right into the first series that we're going to cover and the topic for today.
Okay. My name's Luke Vennard. I am pretty much known as a finance guy. That's what I've done for the last 20 years. I've been in finance. I run a private placement investment firm. I'm your average dude. Been married for coming up on 20 years. Have 4 kids, 3 girls, 1 boy. Love basketball, cars, God, philosophy, some of those things. Spent the majority of my life, trying to learn money so that I could make a good living and try to get past what money represented in most people's lives, which is kind of the be all end all for decisions. And now that I'm kind of on my way out from that game, I've just started looking for kind of another purpose. I've always been moved by the deeper questions, things like, where do we come from? Why are we here? What's our purpose? Where are we going? I've always loved the cosmos and, some of the more esoteric ideas around theology and philosophy and some of those things. And so it's kind of where I want to go for the next 20 years. I'd like to become an expert in that field. I spent a lot of years honing my skill set in finance to become the best at what I did. And I'd like to do the same in this environment.
Why? You can choose to do a lot of things with your time, and being the normal dude that you are, help understand your intentions behind this, what's fueling this, and why are you perhaps somebody who would be qualified to be able to do this?
So I've always felt a deep connection for spiritual things. I think that that's an important part of fulfillment in a person's life. I find tremendous meaning through spirituality. I think that there's a real epidemic in today's world with feelings of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, nihilism, all of these aspects. I mean, you can get on Reddit, and any given thread in Reddit is just filled with nihilistic people who are unhappy with the circumstances they're in and where the way things are going. And what I've found is that the joy we feel in life has little to do with the circumstances of our life and everything to do with the focus. And I think that a tremendous place to focus is on these big questions, the meaning of life, to delve into the nuance of the philosophical arguments that have been made throughout history to try and better understand man, his history, the meaning of why we're here, and our purpose for going forward. And I really don't love the nihilistic view. I don't think that serves anybody well. I think that, like Nietzsche said, the death of God essentially tends to lead towards nihilism and eventually destruction. And I think that perpetuation of the human race is an ideal thing. I think it's a good thing to strive for. And I think that one of the best ways that we help with that psychologically, mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, is to kind of, discuss some of these issues and show why belief in God or pursuit of higher things is actually a worthwhile endeavor.
I think that's well said. Why am I here? Do you want to take a stab at that one? Or
Sure.
Do you want me to articulate my
listen, for me, the reason that you're here is to help probe, to draw out questions, to, help the dialogue flow smoothly, to provoke, thought, to maybe push back on certain concepts, to make it more of a flowing dialogue than just a monologue from me. The other reason I actually like to have you here is I understand that I am fallible. Not all my ideas are right. I know that. I learned in business that iterations of failure is part of becoming the best. And so I have no delusions that how I think is the be all end all.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have a sounding board. It's nice to have somebody who can push back and, thinks a different way or is more analytical or whatever, right? Can look up and kind of give counter arguments to some of the thoughts that I've had. And maybe we can flush those things out, see where they go. I'd like to build a solid foundation for my belief system. And I think that a lot of that comes through, having other people.
Yeah. Well said. So the first series that we're going to produce here is going to be called The Case for God. And one of the most compelling cases for God is the very planet and universes beyond our universe, the cosmos. And so we're going to start out by unpacking really the case for universal design. Why do you think this is the most relevant or best place for us to start?
The reason I think that universal design is such a good argument to begin with is because since probably, the 18th century, science has moved in a direction where most people that are involved in it have thought that science disproves God. And that has led us to this underlying belief system of scientific materialism, which is that all things within the earth can be explained by materialistic means, and we don't really need God. There is explanatory power in man's scientific research to explain every aspect of the universe. But I don't think that that's accurate. I think that as science continues to progress, not only in cosmology, but in geology and biology and mathematics, we're starting to find that there is actually good evidence for an intelligent designer behind the universe, behind biology. Darwin's theory of evolution is, I think, all but dead. It's pretty much disproven at this point. The Royal Academy, which is essentially the most prestigious and probably well-respected scientific body that exists, I think came together 6 or 8 years ago. And the entire purpose of their convening was that they needed a new theory because Darwin's theory of evolution had essentially been disproven at this point. But you still have a whole subset of the globe that believes in this, because it's in every textbook, it's taught to every child, it's, it's just permeated all of society for so long that it's become almost like a dogma. I think that there are beliefs in science that are so entrenched that even given solid evidence, people are not willing to abandon those previous beliefs, which has always been the criticism of religion. It's that religious people are so fanatical in their beliefs that when presented with evidence to the contrary, they throw that evidence out and just continue to believe. And so I think that the design argument for the universe is probably the most poignant way of getting at, the case that can be made for, the death of scientific materialism.
This is going to be, I think, really meaningful to start to unpack. Before we do, what is this all for? Right? Like, if it's so incredibly nuanced that it's nearly impossible, maybe impossible to find consensus around this, then what's the point?
Yeah, for me, it's this. So while rational argument doesn't create belief, it enables a culture in which belief can flourish. What nobody has the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. And so there has to be the ability to defend one's belief systems. And I want to provide that. I want to be able to provide the ability to defend one's beliefs if they are based in God or theism.
Yeah.
I think that's super important.
So part one of this, we're going to go into a couple of different quotes that I would love for you to read, and we can start to unpack this around scientific materialism versus universal design.
Yeah, or theism. So these are kind of two well-known quotes that I think are kind of the epitome or antithesis of scientific materialism, and kind of where that argument leads. So Bertrand Russell said, "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental allocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." I mean, gosh, that's a brutal quote. If that doesn't lead one to just think that any action they take in life is just meaningless, I don't know what else would. And I don't think that's a positive train of thought. I think that you can see in almost every philosophical argument that goes that way to nihilism, that doesn't lead to anywhere positive for mankind or, people in general. That's just a very difficult way of thinking. Richard Dawkins, very similar. In a universe of electrons, selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's such a sucky way to live. I do not subscribe to that one bit, that we're victims of a cosmic accident. No freaking way. That to me just does not ring true. They talk about, trying to be fulfilled in one's life. I don't see how one can be fulfilled when the outlook is that everything you do is insignificant and has no meaning, because eventually it will be buried in the collapse of the universe. I agree more with like Jean-Paul Sartre, who says no finite point has meaning without an infinite reference point. meaning essentially that we as finite beings can look to an infinite reference point of life after death and find meaning. There is no meaning to be found if, as finite beings, this is all there is. How can one find meaning in that? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
Meaning that will ultimately compel you to behave and do certain things that will lead to what at the end of the day? Like, in your mind, what are we all striving for?
I mean, at the very baseline would be the betterment of society. Because if there is no good and there is no evil, then what do choices matter? How do we say that rape of women and children is morally wrong? You're talking about moral relativity, the argument of morality, which we'll get into. But it's like, if that's your thought process, then that allows for just some crazy things to happen, like the Holocaust or Mao or, Stalin or any of these insane dictators who were able to view people as a means to an end because they don't put any actual stock or importance in the eternal nature of humankind. So I just think that throughout all history, this type of thinking, the Dawkins and Russell and the nihilism, and it doesn't lead to anything good. Heisenberg. This is one of the reasons I want to get into, really delving into the scientific aspect of some of these things. He says the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you.
It's brilliant.
And I've seen that over and over and over just in my study of, people that have found, some of the laws of nature or have stumbled on some of these great concepts of the mysteries of the universe, that when they come to these conclusions, they realize that things are too highly ordered. There's just the probabilities are so vastly improbable that most of these people are convinced that behind the order of the universe, there is some great intelligence. I mean, there's a quote, Hoyle, right, who discovered the resonance frequency in stars to create carbon, said this: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces we're speaking about in nature. The numbers on calculates from the facts seem to be overwhelmingly as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. I really think that is the truth. I'm convinced of it in my study. And I want to unpack that. I want to continue to study, spend 10,000 hours, Malcolm Gladwell, to become an expert in understanding those things so that I can, with a level of specificity and resolve, make those same conclusions, come to those same conclusions.
One thing that I'd like to put out there as we get into some of these scientific conclusions that are going to be addressed and made throughout some of these arguments today is that highly analytical thinkers, I think, tend to struggle with, once you've gone to the depths of rational thinking, then when is it appropriate to start to exercise faith, right? Because you think about, we could argue rationally forever. Mm-hmm. And if there's not some element of faith in our convictions, then neither of us is going to move in either direction, perhaps, right? Yeah. So where does faith come into play as part of these arguments?
I mean, at the end of the day, some of these things are unknown. We have to use an inference to the best explanation, which is another word for faith. That's science's term for faith. It's inference to the best explanation. I mean, that just more or less came to me from that standpoint, but that's essentially what science is saying when they use that term. It's saying we can't 100% prove this, because if you think about proof in life, we don't base our life on proof, right? If I said, prove to me that we're having this conversation, that this is reality, that we're actually here, that we're sentient beings, you can't prove any of that. So we live life based on evidence.
Yeah.
And from
But
evidence,
believe
we
that.
draw conclusion.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's a matter of finding the evidences that allow us to draw a conclusion. I have an older brother, genius level thinker, very logical. He had this epiphany just maybe a month ago to allow intelligence to be a portion of what has caused science and all these things to happen. He's been mind blown for like the last 30 days because intelligence behind the universe was kind of the key that unlocked for him all the things that he couldn't understand from a logical perspective. And it's so interesting to me that we have a scientific community that won't allow for intelligence as a baseline or a reason for creation of the things that are around us.
Yeah.
When everything that we create comes from our own intelligence. So to me, it's just, that portion of the missing aspect in science, which is to allow for an intelligent designer behind it, to allow for a rational mind to be a cause of some of the reason that things exist, I think is a point that escapes even the most intelligent people. But it's amazing to me that you have people with such great levels of intellect who just, like I said, can't see the forest for the trees. They get so bogged down in these minute details that their ability to actually perceive almost becomes muted.
Very well said.
Super interesting to me.
Yeah. So the next thing that we're going to do you want to read the Blaise Pascal quote?
I mean, we can. It's very similar to Heisenberg. So Blaise Pascal said, "A little science estranges men from God, but much science leads them back to him." Same conclusion, right? That at the end of the day, when one thoroughly delves into an aspect of science, at the bottom of that, they're going to find a level of design that essentially leads them to believe that somebody has monkeyed with the physics because the level of order is so highly, improbable. And that, to me, I think is the power, because even most atheistic scholars will say that the most convincing argument to them is the design argument because of the mathematical probabilities around, the fine-tuning, the anthropic fine-tuning of the universe.
Yep. So we're going to start getting into some of the theoretical arguments that exist here.
Sure.
Starting out with the Kalam cosmological argument. So
Yep.
Let's start to unpack this.
Yeah. So I think, the Kalam cosmological argument is one of the most simple, but also one of the most convincing. So it has 3 steps. It essentially says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, you could make an argument that premise 2, the universe began to exist, is an assumption. I think probably the major argument to that is that who's to say that the universe is not infinite, or the multiverse, or the oscillating universe, or right? And I mean, we could kind of delve into that now if we want, talk about the singularity theorem and, Bohr, Guth, and Vilenkin.
Yeah, I love
and the
those.
finite nature of the universe.
We spent time on my podcast talking about those, and I really loved diving into those. So let's do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, to refute that argument about the infinite nature of the universe, because that's where science has gone. Science has essentially said that in order to refute some of these very strong logical arguments, they create actually non-scientific models that have never been observed, that science doesn't actually purport to be accurate, in order to kind of circumvent this. I call it mental gymnastics. So they're doing some mental gymnastics. The problem is that you have some very strong theorems that have been put forward in the last 30, 40 years that essentially debunk this infinite nature of the universe. So the first one would be Hawking, Ellis, and Penrose in the singularity proofs. So essentially what they proved is that the universe was expanding. And then mathematically, they showed that. And then they said, if you take that back down, you can essentially reverse that mathematical theory to show that the universe comes back down to a singular point in time and space called the singularity, which has infinite density and curvature and has zero spatial volume. Well, the question then becomes, how much stuff can you fit in zero spatial volume? Well, the answer is nothing.
Nothing.
No matter, no energy, no nothing. So if you can't fit anything materialistic inside of the singularity, then how does scientific materialism explain the beginning of the universe? Well, you would have to discredit that theorem, the singularity proof. And that's what science did. They built some scientific models that allowed them to circumvent the singularity theorem by Hawking, Ellis, and Penrose. And they created the multiverse theory, right? Which says that there could be other unseen galaxies in multiple, essentially like, what would you call that? Dimensions that were happening simultaneously that eventually allowed for, the creation of our universe. Okay, I guess you could make that argument. It's not really well supported, and I don't think any real rational scientist actually believes it. There was I think it was Stephen Myers one time was debating a scientist about that, and he brought up, the multiverse as kind of a counter to Stephen Myers' argument about the singularity theorem. And afterwards, they were riding in a car together and they're kind of friends. And he basically asked him, like, do you actually believe, the multiverse theory? And he said, no one actually believes that. But we put it forth as an argument to defend our position, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just what we have to use. But it just goes to show that even they're being facetious in putting that forward. They know that it's not an actual logical argument that should be used. But in order to defend their dogma of, say, Darwinian evolution or scientific materialism or whatever it may be, they're willing to use false arguments that they know are false, that maybe can be proven mathematically or, have some type of proof to them, in order to not have to evacuate their position. And I get that that's difficult because this is a fundamental underlying position for them in all of their professional studies and scientific research and all of these things. That's the underpinning. And to throw that out, it's very difficult. It's like a faith crisis, right? Very difficult. So what's interesting to me, though, is there is another theorem, Board, Guth, and Vilenkin. It's called the BGV theorem, which essentially is very broad and has shown that all cosmological models in which expansion occurs, including inflationary cosmology, the multiverse, the oscillating, and the cosmic egg models, are subject to the BGV theorem. So Vilenkin argues that evidence for a beginning is now almost unavoidable. As he explains, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Since our universe is expanding and the Board-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does not depend upon any energy conditions, the theorem has reinforced one of the main conclusions of the original Hawking, Penrose, and Ellis result, i.e. that the universe had a temporal beginning, albeit on different theoretical grounds. This has now been proven by both observable astronomy and theoretical physics. So it's proven that the universe is finite. That essentially destroys scientific materialism.
Observable astronomy.
Yep.
I mean, how is that possible, right? Because we only have data going back hundreds of years on astrology, right? And so
Yeah,
how could we possibly prove through observable?
you'd have to look it up, but they can. They can actually see the expansion of the universe in cosmology now. So we have ways of viewing the expansionary aspect of the universe in cosmology. We've been able to actually see the expansion of the universe through modern scientific discovery in cosmology. Come a long ways in our ability to observe the universe, which actually, I mean, this is a little tangential, but is one of my arguments about the design of the universe and where the earth is placed, that we're actually in the optimal position to be observers of the universe. So not only are we in the optimal position for sentient life to be complex sentient life, which is what we are, we're also in the optimal position to observe around us all of the universe, which is incredible to think about. We can get into that a little later in the portion of this I call the rare earth, which is essentially, how rare our position in the galaxy and the universe actually is. But I think that's another argument for design, is that if we were placed in any other aspect of the galaxy, we would not have the ability to observe the universe as we do and to uncover the mysteries of the universe like we do. Not only that, but then you can get into the whole argument of consciousness. Like if we are just, evolution of random, non-thinking, whatever you want to call it, right? What is Dawkins' quote? If we really are just properties from a bottomless, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind pittiness and difference, random selection and natural selection and random mutation, then why have we evolved to be able to understand the intricacies of the cosmos? We should just be hunter-gatherers. We shouldn't be worried about the cosmic makeup of, orbiting planetary systems and stars. But somehow we have the intellect to be able to observe and decipher the mysteries of the universe. That in and of itself to me is proof that we're not just random mutation from a single-celled amoeba over thousands of years. Because every other observable animal in our universe does not have the rational capability to even understand that they're on a planet, let alone to delve into the mysteries of how that planet functions, where it's at in its universe, in its galaxy, and where that galaxy is in the universe, and how all of those function. I mean, that to me is brilliant in and of itself, man's ability to comprehend.
There's a few things there that I want to touch on. So how does universal expansion support the case for universal design?
Yeah, so talking about that, I mentioned briefly, like in the singularity theorem. So proving universal expansion says what? That the universe is moving out. Well, what does that imply? That at some point it started somewhere. So we can run that backwards, right? So we can essentially take the expansion of the universe and run it backwards. And what does that mean? That eventually it comes down to a point where it was not, where it's nothing. And so that essentially proves that there was a finite beginning to the universe. So I think expansion that's a very important point. That theory that came forth from them and now has been proven in not only observable cosmology, but in theoretical physics as well, is a powerful point to, design of the universe, at least outside of scientific materialism. Which would be to say that, right, something outside of energy, matter, space, time, uncaused causer, unmoved mover.
There's this theory called the Big Crunch theory. Are you familiar with this?
No, not at all.
Okay. According to this theory, the universe will one day stop expanding. Then, as gravity pulls on the matter, the universe will begin to contract, falling inward until it has collapsed back into a super hot, super dense singularity. This is the idea of the theory. Okay, so the idea of the theory is the Big Bang happens. There's a new galaxy. That galaxy starts to expand. It reaches its maximum expansion inside of the universe. And then it contracts into a black hole, into a singular point. And therefore, this is like a supporting sort of theory to the Big Bang.
Sure.
It starts back as what? Another Big Bang.
Sure.
Okay, so you can see.
I think the problem, I see a few holes in that just off the top of my brain. So the first one is when the universe contracts back down, it actually has matter at that point. Because you're talking about taking all the matter that does exist in the current universe and compacting it into a single point. That's different than the singularity, right? The singularity is talking about a point in which there was no matter. So that would never become the singularity in the term that we're talking about, where there is no space-time matter, none of those things. You're talking about compacting matter into the most compact form it can be. Okay, sure. That's a totally different argument. The other argument I would probably make to that is when you look at the cosmological constant, which is the expansion rate of the universe, against the gravitational pull, which is, right, a known number. I don't think that those two show that at any point in the future, the universe does stop expanding. You know, I don't think that it shows, because I believe we show that the universe may actually be accelerating, not decelerating. And this model, it would have to be decelerating in order for that to be factual. Yeah. And I don't know that that's scientifically accurate. I'd have to look into it off the top of my head. But that to me would be another probably downfall of that argument, is that when you take the constants of the current universe, they don't actually support that scientific theory.
Yeah, sure. And actually, one of the next things that we get into here is the cosmic constants.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, you start to outline.
So like the gravitational force constant. So like, for example, gravitational force constant, large scale attractive force, holds people on planets and holds planets and stars and galaxies together. Too weak and planets and stars cannot form. Too strong and stars burn up too quickly. But then, you know, like the cosmological constant refers to the balance of the attractive force of gravity with a hypothesized repulsive force of space observable only at large size scales. It must be very close to zero. That is, these two forces must be nearly perfectly balanced to get the right balance. The cosmological constant must be fine-tuned to something like 1 part in 10 to the 120th. If it were just slightly more positive, the universe would fly apart, slightly negative, and the universe would collapse. So this is your argument, the collapse of the universe.
Yeah.
That's not observable in the current constants of the universe, right? So I think that a well understood scientific backing of the cosmological constant versus the gravitational force would probably disprove the Big Crunch theory.
I.e. how the universe has behaved historically, right?
Yeah, from our observable viewpoint. Yeah. What we've been able to, and not only that, but through theoretical physics, we've been able to model it, right? Now that we understand what the cosmological constant is against the gravitational force, we can then take those and mathematically model out the universe. I don't think that it supports the Big Crunch model. Probably why it's not real well known would be my guess. Yeah. Probably some fringe scientific theory to try and disprove order in the universe. Right? It's another one of the multiverse strategies or whatever else. It's somebody who has a dogmatic belief in scientific materialism that isn't willing to allow intelligence to enter the equation. And so because of that, they're blind to the facts that currently exist.
I think it might be, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but in the research that I did around it, it might actually be Big Bang theorists that are putting this out there as a way to say, see, we were right about
Sure.
the Big Bang.
Sure.
And the Big Bang we're talking about may not have meant from
Yep.
the very beginning,
Yep.
but it could be that
Maybe there was a subset of particles in an environment that allowed for some type of,
since it's been disproven,
but
right?
The funny thing to me about that is, because I've read a lot about that, and in order to create an environment where those things can happen, you go right back to it has to be finely tuned, like exquisitely finely tuned. The only way we're able to ever see that happen is in a man-made lab where we're controlling all of the parameters. And because we talked a little bit about this before we started, but that the laws of physics or laws of nature are set, but the parameters that apply inside of those laws or the variables of the input to those laws is not set. But the only way that we find those laws to be able to act to create things is if the input that we put into them is highly tuned, right? So it's like, yeah, it would take a scientist in a lab creating a perfect environment with the right inputs in order to try and create even some semblance of the Big Bang. And that we've never actually even been able to do that. We've never actually been able to produce any type of meaningful life from a man-made experiment similar to the Big Bang.
Yeah.
That's eluded scientists as of now.
Continue on the cosmological constant. I think we stopped at some point there.
Yeah, well, I mean, we actually stopped at the theorems, but if we wanted to keep going into, say, some of the fine-tuning arguments, I mean, I got a few just to put into context how amazing some of the fine-tuning parameters of the universe are. Okay, so just to give you an idea of some of the other fine-tuned parameters and their, let's call it probabilities, okay? The mathematical probabilities. So like the electromagnetic force is one. So this is the small scale attractive and repulsive force that holds atoms, electrons, and atomic nuclei together. If it were much stronger or weaker, we wouldn't have stable chemical bonds. So we wouldn't have the ability to actually produce any heavy elements or anything along those lines. So the probability for the electromagnetic force is 1 part in 25. Okay, so that's a pretty huge number. That's 10 with 25 zeros behind it. 1 part in that number is the odds that, it is that number, that it is what it is. Okay, so it's fairly rare that it would be that. Then you have like the strong nuclear force, which is 1 part in 200. You have the weak nuclear force to the strong nuclear force constant. Okay, those two offset each other in the breakdown of materials to radiation. Okay, that's 1 part in 10,000. The electromagnetic force to gravity is 1 part in 10 to the 40th. So now we're starting to get into like some massively huge numbers, right? These become so difficult that there essentially is no rational argument for why we would leave that to chance, okay? Because in talking about the fine-tuning argument here, I've got kind of the breakdown of how the fine-tuning argument functions. We can just kind of dive into that. So this is it. The fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. The fine-tuning, I believe, is not due to physical necessity or chance. Therefore, the fine-tuning is due to design. Okay, so we can talk about, right, physical necessity. So that would mean that there's some type of theory of everything, which would explain the way the universe is. It had to be that way, and there was really no chance or little chance of the universe not being life permitting. So, that's difficult to really wrap your head around. There's just no physical reason why the constants and quantities should have the values that they do. PCW Davies says, even if the laws of physics were unique, it doesn't follow that the physical universe itself is unique. the laws of physics must be augmented by cosmic initial conditions. There is nothing in present ideas about laws of initial conditions remotely to suggest that their consistency with the laws of physics would imply uniqueness. Far from it. It seems then that the physical universe does not have to be the way it is. It could have been otherwise. So what that essentially is saying is there are laws of nature which are constants, but those laws of nature have to have inputs in order to act. So like, for example, the force of gravity, right? We know the force of gravity, but that being applied to the size of the earth and the size of the moon, and that the moon is the perfect size to tilt the earth at a 23.5 degree axis, are inputs onto the law of gravity, right? And they don't have to be, the earth doesn't have to be the size that it is, and the moon doesn't have to be the size it is, and they don't have to be the distance that they are from each other. Those are all inputs that are put into the law of gravity. But it just happens that we have an extraordinarily large moon, which is like, the odds of that are very small. And that moon is the perfect distance from us to tilt our planet 23.5 degrees so that as we orbit the sun, we have temperate seasonal climates. Well, the law of gravity is the constant. The inputs on that, the size of the earth, the size of the moon, the distance from each other, are all just random inputs. And those could have been anything, right? That we have a life functioning earth is ideal because the inputs are just perfect, so that our moon and the earth and the distance and the size are all exactly as they have to be in order for life permitting, gravity to function on the earth. But it's like, that could have been anything else. There's almost an infinite amount of combinations that could have been there. And so that, the fine-tuning parameters of the universe are due to physical necessity is not a logical argument. There is no, all-defining rule that says Earth had to be the size it was and the moon had to be the size it is and they're the distance from each other that they are, and right? That's just, there is nothing there. Because we observe in other galaxies, even planets in our own solar system, that there can be different sized moons that have, closer or further proximity from a planet, and different sized planets, and right? That we fall into this microscopic range of probability that allows us to be the, life abundant planet that we are, I think is not a physical necessity. So that kind of negates the physical necessity argument. The second would be chance. I mean, if you want an actual number for physical necessity, they say that 10 to the 500th power different universes governed by the present laws of nature, so that it does nothing to render the observed values of the constants and quantities physically necessary. Okay? So 10 to the 500th different universes that we can observe that don't actually have the same input parameters that we have in ours that allow for life. So there is no actual physical constant requirement, okay? Because we've seen billions and billions and billions and billions of different inputs. Chance would be the second. So the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the universe being life permitting are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be feasibly faced. Okay. So as with the cosmological constant, the ratios of other constants must be fine-tuned relative to each other. Since the logically possible range of strengths of some forces is potentially infinite, to get a handle on the precision of fine-tuning, theorists often think in terms of the range of force strengths. So this would be like taking gravity, the weakest, and the strong nuclear force. Okay. The strong nuclear force is 10 to the 40th times stronger than gravity. That is 10,000 billion times the strength of gravity. Think of the range that's represented by a ruler showing that probability. Okay. This would be like a ruler that is the expanse of the known universe. Okay. 15 billion light years. Okay. So we now have a 15 billion light year ruler. If we were to move the difference between gravity And the strong nuclear force, even just a minute iota, 1 inch on that 15 billion light year ruler, it would destroy the universe that we live in. It would not be here. It would not be life permitting. Right? So you want to talk about exquisitely fine-tuned. You're talking about a 15 billion light year ruler, and you have to be within an inch. Almost incomprehensible, right? What does 15 billion light years even mean?
Yeah, we can't comprehend that.
I mean, you could calculate it. What's the speed of light? Off the top of my head, I don't know the speed of light, but it's so many thousands of miles per second, right? And that's actually one of the fine-tuning parameters of the universe. Did you know that? The speed of light?
15 billion light years, 8.8 times 10 to the 22nd power. Yeah. Which again, we did a 10 times 10 to the 80th or something earlier, and it was incomprehensible to the human mind.
Even 10 to the 80th. 10 to the 80th is all known particles in the universe.
Just by itself.
Yes.
So 8.8 times 10 to the 22nd.
Yeah. Well, and what's so interesting about this, so when you look at chance, do you know what the mathematical probability for zero is? If something exceeds a number, then the mathematical probability essentially becomes zero. It's 10 to the 50th. So 10 to the 50th in mathematics is considered zero. The probability is so infinitesimally small that it will never happen mathematically. It's considered zero. I mean, almost all of the fine-tuning parameters of the universe fall into the zero category mathematically. There's no chance ever that they would happen. Now, what's super interesting is that all of them by themselves essentially fall into the probability of zero. But to get the actual probability of the universe, you have to take each of those probabilities multiplied by the probability of the others. So, you're talking about the cosmological constant, which is 1 in 10 to the 120, 1 in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd. And it's just a stupid number. That's a single one. You got to times that by all the other constants, 20 other factors. Now what does the probability become? I mean, it's just so tremendous that I don't see how anybody who is a rational thinker can look at that and think that that happened by chance. That to me doesn't seem intellectually honest. That seems to me to be dogmatic.
I wonder what percentage of the universe believes that could be the cause, is just pure chance.
What percentage of the world?
Yeah.
I think it's a large part. Because if they didn't, they would believe it was by design. And do you think that most of the world believes it's by design? No, they don't. But I don't know how many of them actually know that. Right? Have you ever heard that articulated by anybody on social media? I'm not sure that I ever have.
No.
At least not in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
That's really the reason that I wanted to try and do some of this, is because as I started to come across some of this research, I'm like, God, this is building a logical foundation that to me is so solid that I think it makes a phenomenal argument for the design of the universe. Mm-hmm. Because it sure as heck isn't chance, at least not mathematically. That to me is by far the most convincing argument.
So we go through.
So that's fine tuning of the cosmological aspects. Then I talk about how rare the Earth is, because this is another thing I think is not really well known by general people. Okay, so like early Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Telomere, said that the Earth was stationary. This geocentric idea was the foundation of Western cosmology for 1800 years. 1543, Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus ignited a revolution in his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, where he argued that the Earth was moving, and for the first time we had a correct understanding of the workings of our solar system. I wrote here, this to me is a perfect comparison for science and allowing for intelligence in its thought process, an intelligent designer. I feel like so much of science starts to make sense when you allow for a cosmic designer, when you allow for intelligence to be input into the models that we currently run. Because it just makes perfect sense. You're out of order.
No, but there's, I think these things tend to go pretty hand in hand, but I think there are several points, and maybe these are points we, rattle off today, and if we feel compelled, go deeper on in the future, right? So you mentioned some of them, right, which are like the cosmic constants, the electromagnetic force constant, the strong nuclear force constant, the weak nuclear force constant, the cosmological constant. But then you have, Luke, almost 15 more in here. So perhaps before we go to rare earth.
Yeah, you want me to run through all of the parameters? I mean, at least this is a very conservative list. Some people have lists that are 100 long. This is like a peer-reviewed, highly scientific, not debatable list of fine-tuning parameters. This is like the smallest, most well-documented list of fine-tuning parameters.
And I think this is from intelligentdesign.org.
Yes,
right?
It is. This list is.
Yep.
So cosmic constants, gravitational force constant, electromagnetic force constant, strong nuclear force constant, weak nuclear force constant, cosmological constant. Okay. Initial conditions, you have the initial distribution of mass energy, the ratio of masses for protons and electrons, the velocity of light, the mass excess of neutron over proton, then local planetary conditions, steady plate tectonics, right amount of water in the crust, large moon with right rotation period, proper concentration of sulfur, right planetary mass, near inner edge of circumstellar habitable zone. And this is kind of a repeat of what we're going to talk about in rare earth.
Yeah.
Because, these are all things that fall in the rare earth. I don't know that I actually used all that they have in here, because I actually, on my rare earth portion, came from a different place than the Design Institute, or what's it called?
It's the intelligentdesign.org.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great resource.
Yeah.
If you guys want to know more about these constants and the argument for intelligent design, that is a phenomenal resource. I think that's run by Stephen Myers.
Jay Richards wrote this article, but I think
Stephen Myers is one of the proponents. I think he runs the Design Institute or something, which is behind, the intelligent design.
Yep.
And he's got some phenomenal books. If you want to read a book that encompasses a lot of this extremely well, his latest book called The Return of the God Hypothesis is phenomenal. Phenomenal.
Amazing.
So anyways, Nicholas Copernicus, he essentially ignited a scientific revolution because he understood that Earth was moving around the sun. And so for the first time, we had a correct understanding of the workings of our solar system. But he had to essentially spit in the face of 1,800 years of prior geocentric, cosmological models where the Earth was at the center. I think at one point...
Longer. 1,800 centuries.
It may have been 1,800 centuries.
I mean, right?
I may have written that wrong. It may have been 1,800 years, I think is what it is. 1,800 years. Okay. Probably 180.
I like that you said that.
Yeah.
18 Well, if you're talking about Aristotle, I think that's 1,800 years, roughly.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. So 1,800 years.
Typo. I love
For
it.
sure. 1,800 centuries. That's a lot of years. Times that by 100. So add 2 zeros. That'd be like 18 million years, 1.8 million years. But anyways, what's interesting to me is that he had to fly in the face of conventional scientific knowledge at the time, went against the church. I mean, those are serious things. Get yourself killed. But you know what's so interesting is there's a principle called the Copernican principle, which I think actually is the opposite of Copernicus's writings, which essentially says that it like supports scientific materialism, but Copernicus did not support scientific materialism. In fact, he attributes all that he learned and understood through trying to comprehend the mind of God, that there would be order to the universe, and that God was a rational being like we were. That's another thing I find interesting, is that science wants to argue that belief in God is anti-scientific, but all of the fathers of science, Copernicus, Newton, Galileo, they all were faith-based researchers. So I find that super interesting.
Was there a debate on that at some point? Like, it wasn't always known that these men were spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? That has been taught wrong for a lot of years, historically speaking. Yeah, that's conflated often, that the early fathers of science were disproving God. That's not actually how they functioned. If you go read any of the works of the early, Principia Mathematica or Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, they're all highly spiritual. And they all believe that the reason that the universe is so ordered is because it's designed by God. And that's why they had faith that they could actually interpret the universe, was because they believed that it was designed by a creator to be intelligible, and that we had been given the capability to understand it. And so they led into that with faith, believing that it would be, logical, simple and logical for them to follow. And that's exactly what they found. Which is interesting, because now science wants to try and disprove God, but that's not actually where science actually came from. Yeah. The genesis of science was believing that intelligence was the designer of the universe.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's so interesting. That's why I said this is a great, the Copernicus discovering that the Earth was not the center of the solar system is the same thing as like intelligence in scientific research. They don't allow for it now because they're so dogmatic, but it really damns their progression in a lot of ways. Same thing that happened to the scientific community for 1800 centuries. They couldn't make mathematical sense of anything that was going on because they had the Earth as the center. It was a geocentric model. And so none of the mathematical computations made sense, but it's because their premise was wrong. And I think that the argument for intelligent design does the same thing. You take like, who was it? Maxwell said this. He said, asking me to conduct science without God is like telling somebody to choose between Ford or manufacturing for the production of the car. Like, yeah, you have to have both.
Yeah.
Ford and, the ability to manufacture. Ford idea, manufacturing process, vehicle.
Yeah.
Well, science without God, I think, is very similar. It's saying understand the mysteries of the universe, but don't allow for intelligence. One of the things I find most interesting that I don't have in our notes here, but that we can get into for sure later on, is biology, human biology. That to me is as powerful an argument as the fine-tuning parameters of the universe. There is so much in biology that is fine-tuned that works as intelligence. Did you know that they recently discovered that there is a portion of the cell that is a translator, like a linguistics translator, that's taking all these portions of the cell and essentially translating it like Python coding or any coding language that has to have some translating aspect to it. I mean, that in and of itself is mind-blowing that they just discovered that. You know, another reason we thought that like genetic research was going to be the be all end all to like medicine, that you would have be able to do like personally catered medicine or vaccines through genetic alterations. But you know what they found? They found that genetics move like they're intelligent on their own volition. That once they document it, it'll change. Like it's a living, breathing, thinking organism. Have you ever seen the experiment of, what is the experiment where they passed light through a slit and when not observed, it would make wave patterns. And then when observed, it would convert back to a particle and not be a wave. Do you know that experiment, AD? What's the particle?
It's light.
Is it light?
Yeah, light is used.
What's the experiment called?
Double-Slit experiment.
Double-Slit.
Look that up real fast.
Yeah.
This will blow your freaking mind. This is one that they just wrote off because they can't explain it. It operates as if it were intelligent. This is what it is. So electrons.
1801, by the way.
Yeah.
More than 200 years ago.
Electrons from an electron beam. So what happens is this. When the electrons go through the double slit, they make a wave pattern. Okay? Because it's deferred light. And then it bounces off, it creates a wave, and then it hits in like a wave pattern. When they put an observable camera on it, those electrons convert from waves back to electrons. And you know how they do it? They go back in time. I'm like, this is just, it's a mind-blowing experiment. Anybody who watches this, if you've never looked up the double slit experiment, you have to look it up. Because essentially what it does, and you know what's interesting? So they put an observer on it, it changes. They unplug the observer, camera, it goes back to a waveform. It knows that the observer is on or off.
Yeah.
Can't be fooled.
Yeah.
They did another thing. So they had the observer before, when the observer was before the slit, it would go through and it would stay as an electron. It wouldn't turn into a wave. They then moved the observer to after the slit, where the electron went through and became a wave. As soon as they turn the observer on, it goes back in time and becomes an electron and comes back through. How does that function? We have no idea. They can't explain it.
Yeah.
It's as if electrons are intelligent, as if light is intelligent.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't gotten much into gospel, but if you want to get into gospel, what does it say about light in scripture? It says that light is knowledge. That experiment essentially proves that light is intelligent. It has the ability to know when it's being observed and convert itself back into a different structure.
Yeah, and then you go back into the biology of a human, right? This idea gives us the ability to understand light's trajectory at any given time as we see it here,
Yep.
right? So there's, I think, some of the things that we could get the audience excited about around biology. Like, I'll name a few, right? So things like supersized molecules and how a normal human cell has 23 pairs of chromosomes in its nucleus that all play like a very specific role, right? The number of atoms inside of a body. So 7 octillion, which is, I don't know, 20 something zeros.
Yeah.
And by the way, each of those atoms actually matter.
Oh, yeah.
So it's and like as
Structure of the whole. Yeah.
yeah, like over time, the reason that we age and the reason that we have certain things that happen with our memory loss and sight loss and things like this is because those atoms start to degrade over time.
Yeah.
Right. Among other things.
Well, one of the foremost microbiologists is a guy named Michael Behe. If you want to read some material that'll blow your freaking mind, read Michael Behe's stuff because he's a faith-based microbiologist. And so he allows for intelligent design in his research.
Yeah.
And he's just crushing it because he comes from that perspective. There's the flagellum motor. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
I think it was Behe that discovered it. It's a rotary engine on the end of a cell that propels it through the body. It's a literal rotary engine. Like, it's so insane what they're finding in microbiology. But where this is so interesting to me is that scientific materialism, neo-Darwinism, those came out of an age where they thought the cell was a gelatinous piece of nothing.
Yeah.
A single-celled amoeba was just a gelatinous piece of jello.
Mm-hmm.
We now know it's an insanely intricate, highly tuned, linguistic interpreting, machine encompassing. I mean, it's crazy. Anyways, to get back on topic just for a second with the rare earth.
Yeah.
I think, that there's some of this that is super interesting. Okay. So the Goldilocks zone, you're probably familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
So the Goldilocks zone is the distance that the earth is from the sun. You realize that we're within 5%. If we were 5% closer to the sun, we would become like Venus, which is a runaway greenhouse gas planet with temperatures that exceed 900 degrees, right? So you're talking like a minuscule movement towards the sun. The galactic habitable zone. So this is our position in the Milky Way galaxy. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the Milky Way galaxy, but it's a spiral galaxy, which has like at the center is a giant black hole. And the center of the galaxy is crazy. It has like exploding stars and stuff's getting ripped apart by the black hole. And like there's a ton of insane phenomena that happen in the middle of the galaxy. But then coming out from the galaxy are these large spiral arms. Okay. The Earth is essentially halfway between the interior of the galaxy and the exterior of the galaxy. Interior of the galaxy, too dense. Exterior of the galaxy, not dense enough, right? No heavy elements form. Planets can actually become what they are. We're midway between the galaxy. So we're like perfectly in a place where heavy elements can function, but we're not being destroyed by crazy gravitational pull. Then the other things, you have these huge arms that come out of the galaxy. Inside of the arms is pretty chaotic. There's like planet collisions and asteroid belts and all these like highly detrimental aspects to, sentient life. We're tucked right in between two of the major arms that come out of the Milky Way galaxy. Like nice, just perfectly right in the middle where we're protected from anything coming at us from exterior places in what they call the galactic habitable zone. So, it's just like, it's the perfect position. And that's what they say, even within the habitable zone, we needed to be placed just outside of a spiral arm.
Mm-hmm.
We're orbiting a main sequence G2 dwarf main sequence star. So low percentage of stars are this size and makeup. This allows for perfect prolonged orbit and temperatures. So we just happen to be around a G2 dwarf main sequence star, which is like super nice. And our G2 main sequence star it's interesting. I think I have in here later on is the light that it gives is like the perfect light for us to be able to observe. We'll talk about that, which is another super improbable thing. But protected by gas giant planets, right? So the giant gas balls that sit outside of us, Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, right? They have high gravitational pull. So anything that actually comes towards our solar system gets eaten up by those giant gas balls, right? So we have like these big protective shields that are always protecting us from things coming in to try and destroy Earth. Then you have nearly circular orbit. So there's a lot of planet orbits that aren't circular. And what happens is over time, those get skewed further and further and further until it destroys the orbit cycle of those planets. So we have like a perfect circular orbit in order to keep us in the habitable zone of our sun for an extended period of time. Oxygen-rich atmosphere. 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% CO2. It's 1% of the planet's diameter. So we have like the perfect atmosphere, affords a temperate climate, protection from the sun's radiation, and perfect combinations of gases for liquid and complex life. We have the correct mass. Earth is like the perfect mass, size. Orbited by a large moon. We talked about this, right? Rare moon size for our planet size. Stabilizes us at a perfect 23.5 degrees, assuring temperate seasonal changes. Only observable planet with this size moon. This is an interesting one. So I found this, I was listening to a video about solar eclipse. Did you know that the sun is exactly 400 times the size of the moon? And did you know that the sun is exactly 400 times the distance that the moon is from the earth? What does that cause? That causes solar eclipses, which are almost perfect. So we are on the best planet in the best solar system with the perfect size moon at the perfect distance from our orbiting sun to be able to observe solar eclipses. Well, what has that allowed us to do? So the first time that we viewed a solar eclipse scientifically, we were able to see the chromosphere perfectly, which gives off the light spectrum of the sun. Through the spectrum, we're able to determine what the sun is made of, which we now use to determine what every other planet in the solar system is made of. That spectrum that we were able to get because the moon is exactly 1/400th the size of the sun, and the distance is exactly perfect, 400 times the distance from Earth to the moon, moon to the sun, so that we have a perfect solar eclipse that can be observed by us. The one planet that has observable beings on it, or beings that can observe. It's like, that seems too coincidental to me. Amazing coincidence that the one place that has observers has the perfect place to observe eclipses. Magnetic field. You know that the interior of the earth is made up of metals that are moving and that they create a magnetic field, which anything that gets past the gas giants is repulsed by the magnetic field of the earth.
Just pushes it away.
Yep. So perfect size, combination of material at the right density in the core for a robust magnetic field. Plate tectonics. This one's freaking incredible, right? You know what the plate tectonics do? They allow for the heating and cooling of the earth. They allow for expansion of the earth through season and time. And so like we're on an earth that has these plate tectonics that allow for it to be basically perfectly regulated from a temperature standpoint. Ratio of liquid water to land, and then we're a terrestrial planet. We have a paper-thin crust comparatively, more than a dozen tectonic plates. This allows for temperature regulation, carbon recycling, mixes chemical elements essential to living organisms, shapes the continents, moderate rate of rotation. The probability of these factors is 1/1000th of 1 trillionth. Yeah, say that number again. 1/1000th of 1 trillionth. That's a stupid number. Interesting coincidence is that the same narrow circumstances that allow us to exist also provide us with the best overall setting for making scientific discoveries. Earth's atmosphere is the only transparent atmosphere in our system, allowing for the only opportunity to view celestial bodies. Also, where we are at in the galaxy precisely is the best position for us to be able to observe the galaxy. Low stardust, outside of the spiral arms, relatively flat view of the galaxy to give us the ability to perceive depth and form. Why have we evolved as hunter-gatherers? I wrote this question. Why have we evolved as hunter-gatherers out of necessity? Are we so well suited to reason and comprehend the mysteries of the universe? Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. The electromagnetic spectrum is almost entirely useless. The same narrow part of the spectrum that gives life enables us to observe the cosmos. It's 1/trillionth of a trillionth of the electromagnetic spectrum, and our sun emits a majority of the necessary spectrum for observation. So the light that comes from the sun. for some reason our sun emits this tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, 1/1,000,000,000 of 1/1,000,000,000 of the electromagnetic spectrum that allows us to observe the observable universe. We're just lucky that that's where the light spectrum falls. I mean, it's crazy. So those are my thoughts.
Which of these that we covered today,
Yeah.
right? We went through a fair amount. Do you feel is worthy of going deeper on in part 2?
I mean, probably some of the theoretical arguments we could definitely get into. You know, there's a lot that can be unpacked in those. The moral argument, I think, is a really strong one that we just kind of glazed over.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about moral objectivity and dualism and how theism is kind of the best answer for dualism. Fine tuning of the universe. I mean, I think we did a pretty thorough job there. You know, we could get into like definitions of any of these, like gravitational force constant, electromagnetic force, strong nuclear, but those are just definitions, right? That's not really going to convey any additional understanding of, you know, how dynamic those actually are. Rare earth. I mean, you could talk about more in depth how, like, Carl Sagan, who was one of the early, I believe he was an astronomer, kind of said, he's famous. So there was what's the name of this satellite? There was an early satellite that got launched from Earth. They went all the way out to the edge of our solar system. And it turned back and it took a picture of the Earth. They call it the pale blue dot. Carl Sagan's quote about the pale blue dot is essentially that we're nothing special in a giant, you know, cosmos of all this crazy stuff that's happening. We're just a speck of dust in a light beam. But what's incredible is that, you know, the perspective of that can be so different, because that pale blue dot is in this light beam coming from the sun in the expanse of space. I mean, there's just so much around it, chaos and all these other things. And we're like this little speck of blue dust in this perfect light beam from our sun. And it's like, you can look at that as we're nothing, we're just an accident, or you can look at that as how incredible is it that amongst all of the craziness that's going on, all of these fine-tuning parameters are present on the one planet where sentient life exists.
Yeah.
You know, to me, it's just such a plain argument. It's so easy to see that, yeah, we are that one blue dot in that ray of sunshine in a giant universe of insanity that's been placed in the perfect position at the perfect time with all of the right parameters for us to be able to observe and comprehend the majesty of the fine tuning that went into us being able to exist.
So I think the counter to that, because I agree with your point.
Yeah.
I think we do matter.
Yeah.
I think we are important. I think that
Counter to that is that it's all chance. It's random.
God does know us, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's another counter that's still scientific, which is the idea that we actually don't understand the universe in its entirety. And you think about the number of galaxies in the universe, for example. We talked a little bit about the Milky Way, but there's
200 billion galaxies with a trillion.
2 by 10 to the 11th. So
trillion.
2 trillion.
Yeah, I actually have the number here. I'll tell you.
Roughly.
I wrote it down the other day, I think.
So multiple trillions of other galaxies.
No, I think it's like 200 trillion galaxies with 200 billion planets per galaxy. So, I mean, yeah, that's a staggering number.
It's a lot, right? And so when you think about it, when you think about his quote from that perspective,
Yeah.
it's like, how many galaxies do we actually understand? Like, how many can we see through technology,
Yeah, I
telescopes,
think
etc.?
we can see all those in the observable universe.
But then how many can we understand? And that's a whole
well,
other...
I think the power is that the laws of nature apply to all galaxies the same. And we can observe a lot of galaxies that function under the laws of nature, but the input parameters were not correct for sentient life. Right?
So do you believe there's no sentient life outside of the Earth?
Well, listen, we've been looking for habitable planets for a lot of years. I mean, we've observed how many now, and we've never found another one that's habitable. So listen, is that a joke that God plays on us where he's like, listen, I've built so many galaxies that I'll put you in a place where you can actually observe another living being.
Yeah.
But still you can observe the majesty of what I've created.
Yeah.
Right? Worlds without number. More numerous than the sands of the sea.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, those numbers start to just become difficult to understand.
So to put a bow on this, what in recap did we discuss today?
So very lightly, we talked about some of the theoretical arguments for design behind the beginning of the universe, creative designer or intelligent designer. And then we talked about the fine-tuning parameters of the cosmos in the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang, and what those mean and what the probabilities are, and if they could have been as a physical necessity, if they could have been chance, or if the argument for design is the best. I think we laid out very clearly that design is the inference to the best explanation. And then we talked about Earth and how rare our planet is and how unique the parameters surrounding, complex sentient life are in our solar system, in our galaxy, and in the observable universe.